Hello, sisters. Right Wing Women by Andrea Dworkin. Chapter 5 The Coming Gynocide, page 173. Quote, "And yet, there is a solitude which each and every one of us has always carried with him, more inaccessible than the ice cold mountains, more profound than the midnight sea, the solitude of self. Our inner being, which we call ourselves, no eye nor touch of man or angel has ever pierced. It is more hidden than the caves of the gnome, the sacred adytum of the oracle, the hidden chamber of Eleusinian mystery, for to only omniscience is permitted to enter. Such is individual life. Who, I ask you, dare take on himself the rights, the duties, the responsibilities of another human soul?" End quote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, speech, January 18th, 1892. Quote, "There is no thing named love in the world. Women are dinks. Women are villains. They are creatures akin to communists and yellow-skinned people and hippies. We march off to learn about hand-to-hand combat. Blinton grins and teases and hollers out of his nursery rhyme. If you want to live, you gotta be agile, mobile, and hostile. We chant the words, agile, mobile, hostile. We make it a rhyme." End quote. Tim O'Brien, If I Die in a Combat Zone. There are two models that essentially describe how women are socially controlled and sexually used: the brothel model and the farming model. The brothel model relates to prostitution, narrowly defined. Women collected together for the purposes of sex with men. Women whose function is explicitly non-reproductive, almost anti-reproductive. Sex animals in heat, or pretending, showing themselves for sex, prancing around, or posed for sex. The farming model relates to motherhood. Women as a class, planted with the male seed and harvested. Women used for the fruit they bear, like trees. Women who run the gamut, from prized cows to mangy dogs, from high-bred horses to sad beasts of burden. Those two poles of the female condition are only superficially and conceptually distinct and opposite. Men say the two are poles to begin with, distinct and opposite. That male conceit is registered and repeated until it is easier to repeat the concept by rote than to see the reality. But the concept is only accurate, descriptive, from a male point of view. That is, if one accepts the male definitions of both the acts involved and the women involved. In the course of women's lives, and therefore from a woman-based perspective, the two conditions overlap and intersect, each reinforcing the efficacy of the other. Any woman can be both a prostitute and a mother, a prostitute and a wife, a potential mother, or one then the other in either order, and any woman can be subjected to the imperatives of both the brothel and the farming models of female usage. On a grand scale, more women become mothers, fewer prostitutes. In general, the euphemisms of religion and romantic love keep women from ever recognizing the farming model as having to do directly and personally with them. Modern women do not think of themselves as cows, nor as land that the man seeds. But male-headed marriage incorporates both these vivid traditions of female definition, and the laws have been built on these same images and ideas of what women are for, and the real history of women has had at its center the actual use of women as cows and as land. The way women are treated, valued, and used has remarkably little in common with how women perceive themselves. The legend says that vampires cannot see themselves in mirrors, but in this case, the vampire's victims cannot see themselves. What would stare back? The cow, the land, the uterus, the cropped, the plowing, the planting, the harvest, being put out to pasture, going dry? Would annihilate the delusion of individuality that keeps most women going. The laws that made women chattel derive from an analogy between women and cows that hundreds of centuries of men found apt, and the sexual slur was apparently a neutral observation infused with the spleen of the moment. She's a cow. The idea that the male plants and the woman is planted planted in originates in antiquity. The Marcuse, among others, has reiterated the idea that women is the land in more modern times. The farming model is not discussed as such, even among feminists. It too clearly reveals the hopeless impersonality, degradation, and futility implicit in women's subordinate position. The brothel model is far more familiar, partly because the situation of prostitutes is held up to all women as a warning, a threat, inevitable doom and damnation, the hellish punishment of girls gone wrong, punishment for being women involved in sex without the protection of marriage and the purpose of reproduction, punishment for being bad or rebellious or sexually precocious, punishment for being female without the cleansing sacraments. In the brothel model, the woman is acknowledged to be for sex without reference to reproduction. She will still have babies, perhaps, but no one owes her anything. Not the father, not the state, not the pimp, not the John, no one. Some women on the left accept the male leftist view that this is a giant step for womankind, that this separation of sex and reproduction is in fact a form of freedom, freedom from domestic constraints and domestic submission, freedom from an intrinsically totalitarian association of sex with reproduction. They do not recognize that in the brothel model, sex is dissociated from reproduction so that the sex can be sold, so that sex, not babies, is what is produced, so that an intrinsically totalitarian association is forged between sex and money, expressed lucidly in the selling of the woman as a sexual commodity. In the brothel model, the woman is considered to be sexually free, even by those who think prostitution is bad or wrong. Sexual freedom is when women do things men think are sexy. The more women do these things, the more sexually free they are. Whatever the conditions of the woman's life, there is no perception that prostitution is by its nature antithetical to freedom. Sometimes, the prostitute is constructed to be economically liberated. In selling sex, money passes through her hands. More money than the housewife or the secretary will have in hand at any given night. The brothel model particularly fosters these obfuscations of the female condition because the women are entirely interchangeable. Perceived in terms of function, they are entirely interchangeable. Even among themselves, anyone could step out of her life into the life of the next woman and not notice the difference. Nothing that happens in the brothel is seen or has to be seen or recognized or remembered or reckoned with. These women live outside of history and what happens to them behind closed doors and in a place constructed to control the kind of women in it. They live entirely on male terms. Whatever happens to them is appropriate on those male terms because what they do and what they are, all of which is expressed in where they are. The impersonality of the brothel as a working place is precisely congruent with the impersonality of their sexual function. Men romanticize the place and the function for themselves, to themselves, for their own sakes. Men among men. But even men are not so dense as to try to romanticize prostitution to the prostitute. In the brothel model, the women are held to a strictly sexual standard of behavior and accountability. They sell themselves for sex, not to make babies. They do what men want them to do for money, that men pay them, and that they then usually turn over to a man. Women are defined strictly with reference to sex, and they are defined unfailingly without reference to personality or individuality or human potential. They are used without reference to anything but sex orifices and sex class and sex scenes. In the brothel model, several women belong to one man, or in some cases are supervised by an older woman who is herself accountable to a rich man or men. The job of the woman is to bring in, to a man or to a house, a certain amount of money by servicing a certain number of men. They sell parts of their bodies, vagina, rectum, mouth, and they also sell acts, what they say and what they do. In sex, they absorb, endure, and get indifferent toward an enormous amount of male aggression, hostility, and contempt. Men have few restraints in expressing to prostitutes, during sex or in any sexual scenario, their real attitudes toward women as a class. They have no reason to feel constrained, since the woman is there to be a woman, period, to be inferior, subservient, and used. She is there because the man wants a woman, someone exactly of her class, someone who is her sex function, not human, but an it, a cunt. She is there for that reason, not for anything human in her. Her function is limited, specialized, sex specific, and intensely and intrinsically dehumanizing. It is essential to recognize how genuinely accepted both the brothel model and the prostitution are in the social structure, and how this disposition of women is simply accepted as inevitable because they are women. However evil prostitution is held to be, however righteous or religious men are said to be, the brothel model does more than endure, it thrives. However marginal the women are said to be, they form the sex nucleus of a sex industry that is in no sense marginal. The brothel model thrives because men accept it, and all that is part of it, as a proper treatment for sexual women. Women who are sexual in male terms, women who get fucked by many men, women who get fucked outside of protective custody of a traditional father or husband. The staying power of both the brothel as an institution and prostitution as a practice comes from the efficacy of both the regulating of the efficacy of both for regulating the sexual use of women and the disposition of sexually exploitable women. Think of what it means. The brothel is most often something like a prison. Women cannot come and go freely. Women are displayed, used, and treated like sexual things or sexual animals, all penned up. The brothel exists usually with the tacit and overt protection of police and politicians. The brothel is used by the rich and powerful as well as by all other kinds of men. The brothel is the kind of place men like to have women in, confined in, locked in, penned in, shut in. The brothel suggests a wealth of women available to the men. It means he is rich in having so many women in one place for him. It means he chooses absolutely, and his will is done by whomever he chooses. Prostitution is the way women are used in the brothel model. It is what women are shut in for, penned in for. The street corner merely extends the brothel beyond the walls of a building, into the cold and rain. Pimps run several prostitutes, and usually, some or all live together, whether business is done in the domicile or not. This is a version of the brothel, a kind of public harem. The brothel model can simply be imposed on a neighborhood, which then becomes a ghetto for prostitutes. In some cities, with good reputations for socially advanced ideas, women sit in windows, posing for potential customers. This is widely regarded as a humane and civilized way of conducting the business of prostitution. The brothel, in such cities, is considered a nice place, good for the girls. It is the acceptance of the brothel model as an appropriate way of treating some women. These women, sexed women, prostituted women, used women, degraded women, public women, any woman, that has unyielding and unchanging social significance for all women. Once a prostituted woman exists, she can be shut up in a house where men come to find and use women like her, to use her because she is a woman. It is naughty to force her to prostitute herself, though women and girls are mainly forced into prostitution. But once prostituted, by whatever means, she is for sex, and the brothel is her proper abode, and the use made of her there is proper. It is a woman's place, and this is accepted by the religious and irreligious, police and outlaws, users and abstainers. A pimp's women are referred to as his quote unquote stable, but the analogy with horses is misleading. Horses are treated better, being more valuable. Prostitutes get treated like women. No analogy fits. For men, this way of life would be seen clearly as a deprivation of human freedom. For women, it is appropriate to what they are, women. These women are not missed. In fulfilling this sexual function, it is not thought that they are wasted. There is a difference between female garbage and human waste. In the United States, there are hundreds of thousands of these women. In the world, millions upon millions. The brothel model keeps these women locked in for sex, and both the devout and the sexually liberated think that it is the way it should be. Both think this is a sexy way for a woman to live. The women are disposed of, used for whatever they are seen to be, used as their sex, their class defined essence and function. The sex work to which some percentage of the sex class must be dedicated. This use of women is thought to be not only an inevitable and appropriate use of women, but one that always was and always will be. The defenses of the brothel model applied to women are entrenched. His study of prostitution, first established in 1857, William Acton articulated what has come to be accepted as a moderate, sensible point of view. Quote, "It seems to me vain to shut our eyes to the fact that prostitution must always exist. Regret it as we may, we cannot but admit that a woman, if so disposed, may make profit of her own person, and that the state has no right to prevent her. It has a right, however, in my opinion, to insist that she shall not, in trafficking with her person, become a medium of communicating disease, and that, as she has given herself up to the occupation dangerous to herself and others, she must, in her own interest and that of the community, submit to supervision." End quote. The state creates the conditions in which the woman is prostituted. Sanctions force against her to effect her prostitution by systematically ignoring it, creates the economic conditions that mandate her prostitution, fixes her social place so that her sex is a commodity, and then prostitution is seen to exist because the woman wills it, and the political question is whether or not the state should interfere with this expression of her will. What is seen as the eternal dimension of prostitution, why it must always exist, is that the will of women to prostitute themselves will always exist. This means, simply, that men accept that the conditions that create prostitution are acceptable, fixed, and appropriate, because prostitution is a proper use of women, one congruent with what women are. The harm done is when she carries disease. Wherever prostitution is legal and regulated, it is usually to control disease, to protect men from disease. The woman is the instrument by which harm comes to the man. It is the social and economic construction of the woman's will that is the issue. Both in that feminists assert that this will is constructed outside of the individual, and in that apologists for the sexual exploitation of women, again both religious and irreligious, insist that the will is interior, individual, an individual assertion of a female sexual nature. The notion of female will always articulate in discussions of prostitution and currently pornography. Also is central in a new area of discourse on what women are for, surrogate motherhood. A man, married to an infertile woman, or on his own, wants a baby. He buys the egg and the use of the womb of a surrogate mother, a woman who will accept the introjection of his sperm through artificial insemination, gestate, and give birth to what is contractually established as his child. In vitro fertilization, in which the egg is extracted from a woman surgically, fertilized in a petri dish, then vaginally introjected into the female, expands the possibilities of surrogate motherhood. The uterus is exempt from the immune response. Scientists already are able to remove the egg of one woman, fertilize it outside her body, then introduce it into a second woman's uterus, where it will gestate. Note: according to Gina Correa, an expert in these technologies and their effects on women, quote, "Men are hoping to fertilize an egg inside a woman's body, in vivo, flush it out, and then transfer that embryo to another woman. That has not yet been done." End quote. Letter to the author, February 12, 1982. The pure sadism of this seems outstanding. End note. They have not done so, but there is no technological barrier to doing so. These two reproductive technologies, artificial insemination and in vitro fertilization, enable women to sell their wombs within the terms of the brothel model. Motherhood is becoming a new branch of female prostitution with the help of scientists who want access to the womb for experimentation and for power. A doctor can be the agent of fertilization. He can dominate and control conception and reproduction. Women can sell reproductive capacities the same way old time prostitutes sold sexual ones, but without the stigma of whoring, because there is no penile intrusion. It is the womb, not the vagina, that is being bought. This is not sex, it is reproduction. The arguments as to the social and moral appropriateness of this new kind of sale simply reiterate the view of female will be found in discussions of prostitution. Does the state have a right to interfere with this exercise of individual female will in selling the use of the womb? If a woman wants to sell the use of her womb in an explicit commercial transaction, what right has the state to deny her this proper exercise of femininity in the marketplace? Again, the state has constructed the social, economic, and political situation in which the sale of some sexual or reproductive capacity is necessary to the survival of women. And yet, the selling is seen to be an act of individual will, the only kind of assertion of individual will in a woman that is vigorously defended as a matter of course by most of those who pontificate on female freedom. The state denies women a host of other possibilities, from education to jobs to equal rights before the law to sexual self-determination in marriage. But it is state intrusion into her selling of the sex or sex class, specific capacity that provokes a defense of her will, her right, her individual self, defined strictly in terms of the will to sell what is appropriate for females to sell. This individual woman is a fiction, as is her will, since individuality is precisely what women are denied when they are defined and used as a sex class. As long as issues of female sexual and reproductive destiny are posed as if they are resolved by individuals as individuals, there is no way to confront the actual conditions that perpetuate the sexual exploitation of women. Women, by definition, are condemned to a predetermined status, role, and function. In terms of prostitution, Josephine Butler, a 19th century crusader against prostitution, explained the obvious implications of its sex-based nature. Quote, "My principle has always been to let individuals alone, not to pursue them with any outward punishment, nor drive them out of any place, so long as they behave decently, but to attack organized prostitution. That is when a third party, activated by the desire of making money, sets up a house in which women are sold to men." End quote. This is the opposite of what the state does when prostitution is illegal. The state harasses and persecutes individual prostitutes and leaves the institutions and the powerful who profit from them alone. It does this because it is acceptable that prostitution expresses the will of the prostitutes, and that therefore punishing her is the proper expression of hostility toward prostitution. It is precisely this notion of individual responsibility, when in fact there is only a class-determined behavior, that perpetuates prostitution and protects the profits and power of those who sell women to men. Feminists, unlike the state, go after the institutions and the powerful, not the individual women, because feminists recognize above all that the prostitute is created by material conditions outside herself. Note: this does not mean that prostitution is reinvented in every generation only through material conditions. The colonization of women is both external and internal, as Kate Millett made clear in Sexual Politics. Sexual exploitation and abuse create in women a psychological submission to self-denigration. In The Prostitution Papers, Millett went as far as to describe the submission as, quote, "a kind of psychological addiction to self-denigration," end quote. See Prostitution Papers, New York, Avon, 1973, page 96. End note. In the new prostitution of reproduction, which is just beginning to unfold, the third party will develop the female population for sale. It will be the scientist or doctor. He is a new kind of pimp, but he is not a new enemy of women. The formidable institution of institutes, scientific research institutes and medical hospitals will be the new houses of which women are sold to men, the use of their wombs for money. Before the advent of any reproductive technologies, the farming model used to be very distinct from the brothel model. Even though the woman was not human, the land, or was less than human, a cow, farming had the symbolic overtones of old fashioned agrarian romance. Okay. Even though the woman was not human, the land, or was less than human, a cow, farming had the symbolic overtones of old fashioned agrarian romance. Plowing the land was loving it, feeding the cow was tending it. In the farming model, the woman was owned privately. She was the homestead, not a public thoroughfare. One farmer worked her. The land was valued because it produced a valuable crop. And in keeping with the mystique of the model itself, sometimes the land was really pretty, special, richly endowed. A man could love it. The cow was valued because of what she produced calves, milk. Sometimes she took a prize. There was nothing actually idyllic in this. As many as 1/4 of all acts of battery may be against pregnant women, and women die from pregnancy even without the intervention of a male fist. But farming implied a relationship of substance between the farmer and what was his, and it is grander being the earth, being nature, even being a cow, than being a cunt with no redeeming mythology. Motherhood ensconces a woman in the continuing life of a man. How he used her was going to have consequences for him. Since she was his, her state of being reflected on him, and therefore he had a social and psychological stake in her welfare as well as an economic one. Because the man farmed the woman over a period of years, they developed a personal relationship, at least from her point of view, one limited by his notion of her sex and her kind, one strained because she could never rise to the human if it meant abandoning the female. But it was her best chance to be known, to be regarded with some tenderness or compassion meant for her, one particular woman. Nevertheless, the archaic meaning of the verb to husband is, quote, to plow for the purpose of growing crops, end quote. There is not a lot of room for tenderness or compassion in that. Still, it is no wonder that women hang on possessively to any generic association of women as much as such as, quote unquote, the female with the land, nature, earth, the environment. Even though those culturally sanctioned associations posit a female nature that is not fully human and perpetuates a hard and mean tradition of exploitation, there is some splendor and some honor in the association. The association has a deep resonance for men too, though not the same sentimental meaning. They, after all, did the plowing. The cultural and sexual intersection of women and earth is potent for men when they bomb, quote unquote, her, strip mine her, scorch her, torch her, denude her, defoliate her, pollute her, despoil her, rape her, plunder her, overcome, manipulate, dominate, conquer, or destroy her. The significance of the farming model is both wide and deep. It has been the major way of using women as mothers to produce children. Metaphorically speaking, men have used the earth as if it were female, a huge fertile female that, one way or another, they will fuck to death. There are limits to how much the land can endure and produce. Plowed so much, respected so little. Both the farming model and the brothel model dispose of women as women. They are paradigms for the mass use of a whole class. In both, there is no humanity for women. The brothel model has been efficient. It uses women in it until they are used up. Men get sex from them with a graceful economy of means, effective force, hunger, degradation, drugs, rare escape. The woman is easily reduced to what she sells. Women, under the yoke of the brothel model, do not organize political movements. They do not rebel collectively. They yoke it too heavily. The yoke is too heavy. Quite simply, a percentage of the class women is given over to the brothel model. Whatever its laws, societies accept this disposition of a significant number of females for sex service. Once within the model, these women are controlled and used. What men want from them, they get. Their bodies go where their sex is wanted. There is an absolute equation between what they are and what they provide, between their physical bodies and their function, between their sex and their work. There is no wasted energy here. A prostituted female serves her purpose absolutely. The farming model has always been relatively inefficient. It is sloppier. Being a woman who lives in the home with a man on a continuing basis is harder. Picking a woman who can and will have children is harder. There is more leeway for her attitudes to interfere. She has ways of saying no or subverting male sexual and reproductive intentions. The brothel model simply requires that the women under it be women. It does not matter who they are or what they are like, or where they come from or what they think. They get worn down fast by being used the same way and being reduced to the same common denominator. Nothing is necessary except that they be female. The farming model requires the constant application of force, explicit or implicit, usually a nice combination. Incentive, reward, and a lot of plain luck with respect to fertility and reproductive vigor. When a man wants sons, as most do, the, ine- the, inefficiently inherent, the inefficiency inherent in the model is particularly emphasized. No matter how many babies she has, there is no certainty that any of them will be male. And, for all the coercion of the farming model, the women subject to it have organized politically and have found ways to seize the time between babies and domestic chores, here and there, now and then, to foment some rebellion. The very fact that such women have been involved in movements, especially feminist movements, argues for the inefficiency of the farming model. The farming model has haphazard success. There are too many factors besides the efficacy of the fuck that can interfere with the harvesting of the crop. The quality of the crop cannot really be predetermined either. Men, recognizing the inefficiency of the farming model, have simply imposed it on all women not prostituted so as not to miss a chance. They use social, economic sanctions to push women who try to live outside it, especially so called spinsters and lesbians. To anticipate and counterbalance the failures, the losses, the tremendous element of chance, the bad breaks, the power of men as a class has been exercised to keep all women not prostitutes reproducing under the explicit domination of a husband. This has been the best way men have had to control reproduction, to appropriate the uteruses of women in order to have children, to keep the women subject to the reproductive will of the men. The use of women by men in this reproductive tyranny has been presented as what women are for, a proper use of females, the best actualization of their human potential, because, after all, they are women. Reproductive technology is now changing the terms on which men control reproduction. The social control of women who reproduce, the sloppy, messy kind of control, is being replaced by medical control, much more precise, much closer to the efficacy of the brothel model. This changeover, applying the brothel model to reproduction, is just beginning. It is beyond the scope of this book to explore or explain all the new technological intrusions into conception, gestation, and birth, except to say that reproduction will become the new kind of commodity that sex is now. Note: see Gina Korea, The Mother Machine, forthcoming 1984. This book will explain the reproductive technologies, the experiments being done on women and animals to develop these technologies, and the view of women central to both the experimentation and the technologies. End note. Artificial insemination, in vitro fertilization, sex selection, genetic engineering, fetal monitoring, artificial wombs that keep the fetus alive outside the mother's body, fetal surgery, embryo transplants, and eventual cloning. Some experts predict that human cloning will be accomplished within 25 years. However long it takes, it will be done. All these reproductive intrusions make the womb the province of doctors, not the woman. All make the womb extractable from the woman as a whole person, in the same way the vagina or sex is now. Some make the womb extraneous altogether, or eventually extraneous. All make reproduction controllable by men on a scale heretofore unimaginable. The image is not the particular innovation itself, whether it is intrinsically good or bad. The issue is how it will be used in a system in which women are sexual and productive commodities already exploited, with lives that are worthless when not serving a specific sexual or reproductive purpose. For instance, caesarean sections saved women's lives when used in orthodox medical emergencies. But now, doctors use them because they give doctors domination over labor, because they involve cutting into the female body, a male pleasure, and so that the natural process of birth can be circumvented for the social convenience of the doctor. Caesarean sections are now used to express endemic male contempt for women. So it will be reproductive. So it will be with reproductive technology or other medically sophisticated intrusions into reproduction. The ideology of male control of reproduction will stay what it is. The hatred of women will stay what it is. What will change will be the means of expressing both the ideology and the hatred. The means will give conception, gestation, and birth over to men. Eventually, the whole process of the creation of life will be in their hands. The new means will enable men, at least, really to have women for sex and women for reproduction, both controlled with sadistic precision by men. And there will be a new kind of Holocaust, an unimaginable now as the Nazi one was before it happened, something no one believes quote unquote mankind capable of. Using now available or soon to be available reproductive technology in conjunction with racist programs of forced sterilization, men finally will have the means to create and control the kind of women they want, the kind of women they have always wanted. To paraphrase Ernst Lubitsch's Ninochka when she is defending Stalin's purges, there will be fewer but better women. There will be domestics, sex prostitutes, and reproductive prostitutes. Is there any reason to think that this projected future does not reflect the commonly accepted devaluation of women with which we live with relative complacency? Look again at what we have done, are doing now, to the old, those in nursing homes, the drugged, the prostituted, those on welfare, to those bastions of female worth, wives and mothers, whose rape the law protects, whose battery the society invites, whose uteruses the states wants. We come, sorry, quote, we come after. We know now that a man can read Goethe or Rilke in the evening, that he can play Bach and Schubert, and go to his day's work at Auschwitz in the morning. End quote. George Steiner, Language and Silence. Quote, yet the enigma of woman's nature, if she has, that is, a nature and is not merely a person altogether equal, hoof to human hoof with man, the enigma, if it exists, is that women respond to him, of course they do. It is the simple knowledge of the street that murderers are even sexier than athletes. Something in a woman wishes to be killed went the old wisdom before women's liberation wiped that out. Something in a woman wishes to be killed, and it is obvious what does. She would like to lose the weakest part of herself, have it plowed under, ground under, kneaded, tortured, squashed, sliced, banished, and finally, immolated. End quote. Norman Mailer, Genius and Lust. Not wanting to die, and knowing the statism of men, knowing what men can do in the name of sex, in the fuck, for the sake of pleasure, for the sake of power, knowing torture having been able to predict all of the prisons from her place in the bedroom and the brothel, knowing how callous men are to those less than themselves, knowing the fist, bondage, and farming fuck and the brothel fuck, seeing the indifference of men to human freedom, seeing the enthusiasm of men for diminishing others through physical domination, seeing the invisibility of women to men, seeing the absolute disregard of humanity in women by men, seeing the disdain of men for women's lives and not wanting to die, women propose two very different solutions for themselves in relation to men and this man's world. The first honors the sexual and reproductive imperatives of men. This is the right wing solution, though those who pursue it are, in terms of male defined politics, all along the political spectrum from far right to far left. In this solution, women accept the definition of their sex class, and within the terms of that definition, fight to succumb fight for the crumbs of self-respect and social, economic, and creative worth. Socialist movements and revolutions are predicated on an acceptance of this sex class definition, as are right-wing movements and counterinsurgencies. The far right expression of this solution is usually highly religious, and it is the religious idiom that makes it distinguishable from other expressions of what is essentially the same accommodation to male power. Specifically, the sex class accommodation is seen as a function of religious orthodoxy. In accommodating, women are faithful to Divine Father. Women accept traditional religious descriptions of women, female sexuality, and female nature. Women accept the duties of sexual and reproductive submission to men. The far right solution translates the presumed biological destiny of women into a politics of orthodox religion. Even in a secular republic, far right women live in a theocracy. Religion shrouds women in real as well as magical grace, in that the sex class function of women are formally honored, carefully spelled out, and exploited within clear and prescribed boundaries. The second solution is offered by feminists. It proposes, in the words of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, quote, the individuality of each human soul. In discussion with the rights of women, we are to consider, first, what belongs to her as an individual in a world of her own, the arbiter of her own destiny. End quote. This is simply a recognition of the human condition in which women are included. It is also the precondition for the realization of Marx's greatest ethical idea, from each according to her ability to each according to her need. It is the imposition of the sex class definition of women on women, by any means necessary, that devastates the human capacities of women, making them men subordinates, making them quote unquote women. Feminists have a vision of women, even women, as individual human beings, and this vision annihilates the system of gender polarity in which men are superior and powerful. This is not a bourgeois notion of individuality. It is a self indulgent notion of individuality. It is the recognition that every human being lives a separate life in a separate body and dies alone. In proposing, quote, the individuality of each human soul, end quote, feminists propose that women are not their sex, nor their sex plus some other little things, a liberal additive of personality, for instance, but that each life, including each woman's life, must be a person's own, not predetermined before her birth by totalitarian ideas about her nature and her function, nor subject to guardianship by some more powerful class, not determined in the aggregate, but worked out by herself for herself. Frankly, no one much knows what feminists mean. The idea of women not defined by sex and reproduction is anathema and baffling. It is the simplest revolutionary idea ever conceived, and the most despised. In the face of advancing reproductive technology, there will be even fewer women who dare claim their right to human life, human dignity, and human struggle as unique and necessary individuals, fewer and fewer women who will fight against the categorical disposition of women. Instead, more and more women will see protection for themselves as women in religious and devotional ideologies that formally honor the special sanctity of motherhood. This is the only claim that women can make under the sex class system to a sacred nature, and religion is the best way to make that claim, the best available way. Against the secular power of male scientists, women will try to pit the political power of misogynist males in religion. Women will try to use male theology and religious tradition wherever and however it sanctifies the mother giving birth. Women will hide behind theology. Women will hide behind orthodox religious men. Women will use conservative religious ideas against the science that will make the women less necessary than they have ever been. The power of reproductive scientists will be advanced, however, precisely through the political and legislative initiatives of the theocrats. Prohibiting abortion and then mandating forced sterilization will establish absolute state control of the uterus. The clash between reproductive scientists and male theocrats in terms of absolute values, especially the orthodox formulation of what constitutes the family, only appears to be irresolvable. When these two schools of unconditional male power over women have to negotiate public policy to the mutual benefit of both, the men of theology, with that remarkable resourcefulness that allowed for the burning of the witches, will find great virtue in any program in which fertilized eggs truly do supersede women in importance. They will also enjoy having both sex and reproduction on their own terms, being God in the concrete rather than worshipping Him in the abstract. They will also enjoy, for its own sex, the extraordinary control, for its own sake, the extraordinary control they will have over women, more than Leviticus gives, more than Christ mandates, more than men have ever had, though no doubt still less than men deserve. Women will argue, like the true believers they are, for that old time religion, but male theocrats will discover that God intended men to be able to be the sole creators of life all along. Did not God Himself create Adam without female help? And is it not baptism the religious equivalent of being born of a male God? This is not far fetched for those who justify the subordination of women to men on the ground that God is a boy. Ironically, cruelly, so typical of history, ineluctably moving on. Right to life groups are the only the only organized political opposition to reproductive technology, especially in vitro fertilization, and are also the agents of its ascendancy in engineering legislation that would give the uterus and the fertilized egg to the state to protect and control. Note: each fertilized egg in a petri dish is regarded as a human life. Each time one is thrown away or quote unquote dies, murder has been done. End note. Even in giving the state the right to define when life begins, which right to life groups insist on doing, right to life groups are taking that power from religion and transforming it into a police power of the state. For the sake of religion, they are taking from religion its moral authority to demand obedience from the faithful and turning that authority over to a soulless state apparatus incapable of moral discernment. They are taking from God what no atheist would dare and giving to Caesar what he has never dared claim for himself. The women in right to life groups want to protect not fertilized eggs, but motherhood and their own worth as women in God's eyes as well as man's. They will learn the cruelest lesson of history. Quote, every decent end consumes itself. You kill yourself trying to reach it, and by the time you get there, it's been turned inside out. End quote. The words were written by Soviet dissident Abraham Terets, Andrei Senevsky, but every passionate political activist of conscience, whatever the decent end, has had occasion to say them in trouble and in grief. What one means to do goes wrong. It becomes what one abhors. Right to life women will see it is too late. They will stay mesmerized by the small tributes men pay to the idea, not the reality, of women as mothers. The power the right to life women are fighting so hard to put into the hands of the state will eventually and inevitably be used, 1. To redefine when life begins and what life is so that the male becomes its sole creator, and 2. To determine and enforce which women reproduce, when, and how. The women will not need, sorry, the women need not will, sorry, the women not needed will have no claim to civil dignity or civil protection. The reason for female submission, finally, will be very simple and overwhelmingly clear. For women, submission will be a matter of life or death, with the right of appeal to the sacredness of women as mothers no longer in the vocabulary of male supremacy. When women cease to be altogether necessary, politically dissident women become altogether unnecessary. Once women are biologically expendable on a grand scale, political women need no longer be tolerated on any scale. Politically dissident women are considered unnecessary now. This is the mood toward feminists and other women who rebel. Someday it will be policy, not a mood. The criteria for politically dissident women, troublemakers, will be extended to include any women, not domestics, sex prostitutes, or reproductive prostitutes. The religiously orthodox women will find themselves characterized as politically dissident women. One day, too. There they will be, advocating and upholding old laws, customs, and ideas that are no longer in the best interests of men. They will be demanding more than men want them to have, and there will be no concessions from men, because men will be able to control reproduction without the mass complicity of women. Reduced to its simplest elements, the old misogyny was expressed by the ancient Greek Hipponax of Ephesus. Quote, "The 2 days in a woman's life a man can best enjoy are when he marries her and when he carries her dead body to the grave." End quote. In the misogyny of the future, in the coming gynocide, he will have one day he can best enjoy, quote, when he carries her dead body to the grave. End quote. We come after, as George Steiner wrote, and we are women. We know what men can do.